Welcome to another deep dive. I've always found creation stories so fascinating. They really offer these different windows into how cultures across time have tried to grapple with that fundamental question, like, how did something come from nothing?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And some of those creation myths are just truly mind-boggling, right? It's like they tap into this deep human need to make sense of our place in this vast and often baffling universe.
Exactly. And today, we're going to dive into one that I got to say is pretty mind-boggling. It comes from the world of Kabbalah.
Ah, Kabbalah. Yeah, always a good source for some thought-provoking concepts, to say the least.
Absolutely. We're talking about Tzimtzum. And if you haven't heard of it, I wouldn't be surprised. It's a pretty complex but also pretty profound idea.
Yeah, I mean, even within Kabbalah, it's a concept that's been debated and interpreted in different ways over the centuries.
Right, right. So before we get too far into it, why don't we set the stage a little bit? What are our main sources for today's deep dive?
Sure. So one of our primary guides today is a book by Rabino Philip S. Berg called Iniciación a la Kabbalah Tomoe. Berg's approach to explaining Kabbalistic ideas is he tries to make them accessible to a wider audience.
Which can definitely be helpful. Kabbalah can be pretty dense and esoteric
Oh,
sometimes.
for sure. And then, of course, we've got a bunch of classic Kabbalistic texts to draw on as well.
Awesome. So listeners, get ready for a deep dive into Tzimtzum. Now, I know the word itself might sound a little intimidating. It's actually a Hebrew word, and it's often translated as restriction or contraction, or sometimes even withdrawal or concealment.
Yeah, all of those translations kind of get at the core idea here, which is that at the very beginning of creation, there was this act of self-limitation on the part of the divine.
Okay, self-limitation on the part of the divine. Already my brain is doing somersaults. Help me understand this. What exactly is being limited, and why would this be necessary for creation to happen?
Right. So to really grasp this, we need to talk about the concept of Ein Sof.
Okay, so Ein Sof, that's another Hebrew term, right? What does it mean?
Yeah, literally it means without end or infinite. It refers to the ultimate primordial source of everything in Kabbalah. Think of it like the boundless ocean of pure being, limitless potential, without any form or differentiation.
Okay, so far so good. We've got this infinite source, Ein Sof. And it's from Ein Sof that everything else emerges, right?
That's the idea, and Kabbalah describes this emanation from Ein Sof as the, or Ein Sof, which means the light of the infinite. It's like the purest essence of the divine flowing out from this boundless source.
So if we're starting with this all-encompassing infinite light, how does anything else even come to exist? It seems like there wouldn't be any room for anything other than this infinite light.
Yeah, that's precisely the question that Tzimtzum addresses. The Kabbalists pondered how a finite world, a world with separate and distinct beings like us, could arise from a source that is, by definition, unlimited.
Okay, I'm starting to see the problem here. How can something limited and defined even exist within the infinite?
And the answer, as Berg puts it in Iniciación a la Kabbalah, lies in this concept of Tzimtzum. It was this deliberate act on the part of the creator, a self-imposed limitation, a contraction of the divine light inward.
Okay, so we're talking about a deliberate act here. This wasn't just some kind of accidental or random event. This was a conscious choice.
Exactly. It was an act of will. And this is where that idea of restriction or withdrawal comes in. It's like the creator made space, created a kind of vacuum by drawing back a portion of this all-pervasive divine light.
So it's almost like making room, clearing out a space for something new to emerge.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And that's where we get this concept of the vacío, which means empty space. It's the space that was created by this act of tzimtzum.
But I'm guessing this empty space isn't really empty in the way we usually think about it.
You're right. It's not about total nothingness. Think of it more like this. Imagine a room that's brilliantly lit. Then someone dims the lights in one part of the room. That area is now empty of the full intensity of the light, but it's still part of the same room, and it's still illuminated to some degree.
Okay, I see. So this empty space created by the Tzimtzum isn't completely devoid of the divine light, but it's a space where the light is, well, less concentrated, less intense.
Exactly. And it's within this vacío, this space that's been prepared, that the rest of creation can begin to unfold.
So we've got this initial act of restriction, the creation of the vacío, but what happens next? How do we actually get from this empty space to, well, a whole universe?
Well, the Kabbalists describe the next step as the emanation of the Sephiro.
Ah, the Sephiro. Now, we've touched on these in some of our other deep dives. Could you give us a quick refresher?
Sure. The Sephiro are these 10 divine attributes or emanations. the channels through which the infinite, Ein Sof, manifests and interacts with the created world. They represent different aspects of the divine, like wisdom, understanding, kindness, strength, beauty, and so on.
Okay, right, these kind of archetypal energies.
Yeah.
So how do the Sephirot fit into this whole Tzimtzum picture?
There would emerge within the Vasio, the space that's been prepared by the contraction of the divine light. It's like the blueprint for creation is contained within these 10 Sephirot. And from them, according to Kabbalah, all the lower worlds, including the physical universe we know and experience, came into being.
So this act of restriction, of creating this Vatsio, wasn't the end goal. It was more like setting the stage, creating the conditions for the rest of creation to unfold.
Exactly. And it's a pretty radical idea, right? That limitation, this idea of boundaries, is actually essential for manifestation and the emergence of form.
It is. It goes against how we usually think about things.
Right.
We tend to see limitations as, well, limiting. But in this context, they're actually what make creation possible.
And Berg really emphasizes this in Initiation à la Kabbalah, Tome Or. He points out that even the divine, in a sense, limited itself in order to allow for creation to happen.
Which raises another question for me. If this initial act of the Tzimtzum was about making space for creation, for something other than the infinite, does that mean there was something missing in the infinite? Was there some lack or incompleteness that the Creator was trying to fill?
That's a really interesting question, and it gets at some of the deeper mysteries of Kabbalah. The Kabbalists wouldn't say that there was anything missing in Ein Sof in the sense of a lack or incompleteness. The infinite is, by definition, whole and perfect.
Right, okay. So what was the motivation, so to speak, for this act of self-limitation?
Well, it was about creating the possibility for relationship, for dynamic interplay between giver and receiver. In the realm of Ein Sof before Tzimtzum, there was only the infinite outpouring of the divine light, the desire to give.
I see. So for there to be something other than the giver, there needed to be something capable of receiving?
Exactly. And that's where the concept of the desire to receive comes in, which is another key principle in Kabbalah. The act of creating a separate existence, a vashio, that is distinct from the creator, inherently involved the emergence of this desire within the vessels, or kelim, that were formed in that space.
So you're saying that before the Tzimtzum, before creation, there was no desire in the way that we as created beings understand it.
Right. In the realm of pure Ein Sof, there was only the desire to give. But for creation to happen, for there to be something other than the giver, there needed to be beings with the capacity and, crucially, the desire to receive. The Tzimtzum made that possible.
And this connects to another concept we've talked about before, the pan of shame.
Right.
The idea that receiving without giving back can create a feeling of unease, of shame.
Exactly. The Tzimtzum sets the stage for a more balanced, dynamic relationship between giver and receiver. By creating independent beings who are capable of both receiving and giving, it addresses this potential imbalance.
So this Tzimtzum thing isn't just some ancient creation myth. It's more like a fundamental principle that explains how existence itself is structured.
That's right. It's not so much a literal event that happened at some specific point in time, but rather a metaphysical principle, a way of understanding the transition from infinite potential to finite actuality. It highlights this paradox at the heart of creation, that limitation is actually necessary for manifestation to occur.
It's kind of like how an artist chooses a specific medium and a limited set of tools to express an idea. Those limitations actually allow the creative process to happen.
Yeah, exactly. The limitations create a framework, a container for the creative energy to flow through.
Okay, so this has all been super fascinating. But let's bring it back to our listeners. How does understanding Tzimtzum actually apply to our lives? What can we learn from this ancient Kabbalistic idea?
Well, for one thing, it offers a whole new perspective on limitations. Instead of seeing them as purely negative, we can start to see them as the very conditions that make growth and creation possible. Think about learning any new skill you have. To focus your attention, you have to create boundaries to really master something.
Right, right. It's like the saying, less is more. Sometimes limiting yourself can actually lead to greater creativity and depth.
Exactly. And Tzimtzum also encourages us to reflect on this balance between receiving and giving in our own lives. Are we primarily focused on taking in, or are we actively seeking ways to give back?
It's a reminder that true fulfillment, I think, comes from finding that balance, from being both a receiver and a giver.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also suggests that creating empty space in our lives, whether that's in our schedules, our minds, or even our physical surroundings, can be a powerful way to invite new possibilities and growth.
So just to recap for our listeners, Tzimtzum is this foundational Kabbalistic concept about the initial contraction of the infinite divine light. This created a vazio, an empty space, that allowed for the emanation of the Sephiro, these divine attributes, and from them, the emergence of all creation, including our own world. It's a metaphysical principle that helps us understand the paradoxical relationship between limitation and manifestation, and the essential interplay between receiving and giving.
Well said. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it's worth the effort.
Absolutely. And on that note, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. How might the idea of intentionally creating empty space in your own life lead to new forms of creation, understanding, or growth for you? It's something to think about as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Tzimtzum.
It's been a pleasure.